B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, June 24th, 2020. In separate events, we are seeing the increasing corruption of American courts and the so-called Justice Department under Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, we've been following the saga of Mike Flynn, who was briefly the national security advisor to Trump before he got bounced because, based on leaks, it was learned that he had had pre-inauguration communications with the Russian ambassador. And because the FBI had been investigating him, primarily because he went on a paid junket to Moscow, where he had appeared at a dinner seated next to Putin, honoring Russia Today, RT, the television network that is available but not watched so much here in the United States. And as Scott Ritter pointed out to us in our in-depth interview, when was it? Back in late March or early April. Bill Barr has a technical point for arguing that the charges against Mike Flynn should be dismissed. And it is a bare technicality. It relates to whether the investigation into his communications with the Russian ambassador was properly sourced or based. But what we've seen is the most bizarre and unprecedented efforts to control the trial judge in the case of Mike Flynn, Emmett Sullivan. And today, in a big surprise, a federal appeals court, in a 2-1 decision written by a recent appointee of Donald Trump, Judge Naomi Rao, they jumped the shark. And basically, before Judge Sullivan has completed the sentencing of Mike Flynn or a process to acknowledge the call by the Justice Department to dismiss the case, the appeals court has accused the judge of inappropriate behavior, as it inappropriately orders him to yield to the Justice Department and dismiss the charges. I'm not a legal expert, but I've never seen anything like this happen. There is a procedural order, and the lower courts are generally given deference to conduct their business, and then it is reviewed, mostly on technical matters, by the appeals court. And then if the appeals court rules against the trial judge, the parties in the case can appeal to the Supreme Court. That's how it is supposed to work. But the D.C. Circuit, the appeals court, which is considered the second most powerful in this country to the Supreme Court, said that Sullivan overstepped his role, and committed a clear legal error by refusing to immediately close the case, and he basically has scheduled hearings. He appointed a former judge to argue against the Justice Department's order. The appeals court said that Judge Sullivan demonstrated intent to scrutinize the reasoning and motives of the Department of Justice, and that constitutes irreparable harms that cannot be remedied on appeal. And this is just, it's breathtaking. Now, Robert Wilkins is the third judge on the panel. He was nominated by Barack Obama. And he said that the majority grievously overstepped its own authority and has taken the unprecedented step to intervene midstream and force Sullivan's hand before he had an opportunity to rule. And the ruling from this panel, which can be subject to an en banc review, that would be the entire, I think it's 15 members of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. It means, at least for now, that Sullivan can't hold a hearing set for July 16th to formally consider the government's request to dismiss Flynn's case. not only have his hands been tied, but the decision has been made for him. And this is a gross abuse of precedent and the power of the appeals court. And when I discussed this with Scott Ritter in our in-depth interview, we did mention that Judge Sullivan should get the last word on the sentencing of Mike Flynn. So here's more from Wilkins. He cited past cases in which the Supreme Court upheld the power of judges to perform an independent evaluation of the government's action. He said the majority had eviscerated the court's role by preventing any review. Today, quote, the majority declares that nevertheless, in spite of the government's abrupt reversal on facts and the law, and although the government declares itself entitled not to be forthcoming with the district court, these circumstances merit no further examination to determine whether there may be additional reasons for the prosecutor's actions, and if so, if any such reasons are impermissible. And I have one more, a couple more quotes here. This is from Judge Rao's decision. The outcome raised the question of whether Sullivan, who has a lawyer representing him in the appeals court, will ask the full appeals court to reverse this order, or whether the full court might use a rarely invoked rule that permits it to order a rehearing on its own. So, this is not completely settled. And here's a fuller quote from the dissenting Judge Wilkins. It is a great irony in finding the district court to have exceeded its jurisdiction. This court so grievously oversteps its own. This appears to be the first time that we have issued a writ of mandamus to compel a district court to rule in a particular manner on a motion without first giving the lower court a reasonable opportunity to issue its own ruling. The first time any court has held that a district court must grant leave of court without even holding a hearing on the merits of the motion, and the first time we have issued the writ even though the petitioner has an adequate alternative remedy, on the theory that another party would not have had an adequate alternative remedy if it had filed a petition as well. Any one of these is sufficient reason to exercise our discretion to deny this petition. Together, they compel its rejection. So they're dancing over at the Justice Department, and of course Trump is thrilled by this idiocy and this real breach of our justice system. And this occurs almost at the same moment today that hearings were held before the House Judiciary Committee investigating Barr's overreach by pressuring his prosecutors to go easy on Roger Stone. And this is less than a week after Barr forced out Jeffrey Berman, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. So the humorless Gerald Nadler, chair of the Judiciary Committee, began his opening statement by laying into Barr, pointing out the Attorney General's role in the ouster of Berman. If the Attorney General has simply misjudged the situation and thought that Berman would go quietly, then we might chalk up this episode to simple miscommunication and incompetence. But make no mistake, Nadler said, this was not an isolated incident. The effort to remove Berman is part of a clear and dangerous pattern of conduct that began when Barr took office and continues to this day. So the lead witness was Aaron Zelinsky. He's an assistant U.S. attorney from Maryland. He was detailed to the Mueller investigation, and then when Mueller wound down, they put Zelinsky in charge of the final stages of the Roger Stone case, and he's the one who resigned from the case when Barr forced his superiors, that's Zelinsky's superiors, to lower the recommended prison sentence for Roger Stone. So Zelinsky testified that the heavy pressure from the highest levels of the Department of Justice to give Stone a break in the form of a lighter sentence was highly unusual. And Zelensky said, "We took an oath to do our job, to follow the law, to follow the department's policies, to do what's right, and what happened here was wrong." And under questioning by Congressman Eric Swalwell of California, he was asked why he withdrew. "I did that because what had happened was wrong, and I did not want to be a part of what had happened." So the details are more damaging. Zelensky did add names of who he thought was providing the pressure. He said that he and his fellow prosecutors resisted efforts to reduce the sentencing recommendation and were told we could be fired if we didn't go along. When I heard repeatedly that this leniency was happening because of Stone's relationship to the president, that the acting U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia was receiving heavy pressure from the highest levels of the Justice Department, and that his instructions to us were based on political considerations. So Zelensky's outrage is appropriate. He was joined at the witness table by a former deputy attorney general whose name is Elias. And Elias testified about other interventions attributed to Barr related to a case here in California related to the auto industry and emissions standards. And Elias said that this was inappropriate. He also noted that Bill Barr had ordered antitrust investigations into the merger of commercial marijuana companies, and that this was based simply on the fact that Bill Barr doesn't like marijuana. And he was looking for a way to impose that bias on the machinations of the Justice Department. The committee also heard testimony from a former deputy attorney general who had served under Barr. His name is Ayer, and he said that Barr poses the greatest threat in my lifetime to our rule of law and public trust in it. Ayer ticked off incidents that he saw as Barr was working to help Trump at the expense of the institution, that's the Justice Department. He said that Barr had in particular taken aim at post-Watergate measures and sought to give the president nearly unlimited powers by negating or overriding many independent processes that operate as important checks on executive branch operation. So this was a pretty strong hearing. The Republicans trotted out former partisan Attorney General Mike Mukasey, who was the final Attorney General under George W. Bush, who said, "Oh, everything's fine, nothing to worry about, business as usual." And here's a case that won't get any special intervention from Bill Barr or the Trump administration. And I want to be clear, it doesn't have anything to do with the issues that I just presented. But Adam Amin Hassoun is hoping to be released soon. He served about 15 years on a federal sentence that he says was used to try to pressure him to testify against the so-called American domestic terrorist Jose Padilla. And when he refused to do that, he drew a 15-year sentence. The judge cried foul but said his hands were tied, allowed him 6 years credit for time he'd already been incarcerated. Then that sentence was completed in October of 2017. And instead of being released, Hassoun was placed in an immigration cell where he has languished for almost 3 years now. And the ACLU and its attorney, Jonathan Haffetz, have fought hard. This case makes clear as day that the government must never be given the sweeping power to imprison people indefinitely in the United States without charge and without a fair hearing. And so I believe that this is based on his ethnicity and I believe he is a Muslim. I don't know that for a fact. But the so-called Justice Department, under Bill Barr, is working overtime to try to keep Mr. Hassoun behind bars after this incredible and lengthy unjust incarceration. So over in the Senate today, Democrats successfully filibustered the Tim Scott policing reform bill. They lost 3 of their nominal members in the process. Doug Jones of Alabama, who's barely a Democrat. Same goes for Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and Angus King, who is truly an independent from Maine. They voted with the Republicans to accept what is a very weak bill. And I have to say that as the only black Republican in the Senate, Tim Scott is a very persuasive guy. I've seen him on TV with Trevor Noah, I think with Stephen Colbert, and also with the folks on the PBS NewsHour. And he's very persuasive because he talks about how even recently he has been stopped for driving while black. And he's very good at posing as identifying with the pain and suffering of black Americans. But the bill that has his name on it is incredibly weak. And to be fair, so is the package of proposals from the Democrats. And I'm linking to a great op-ed published in the Washington Post today by Radley Balko. He wrote a book about police reform a few years ago, and he appeared, I think it was last Friday, on Bill Maher's show. And he is a very articulate critic of the police structure in this country. He writes, "The competing bills recently introduced in the House by Democrats, the Senate by Republicans, are not seizing this moment so much as gently taking it by the hand and asking in hushed tones if it would like to come along. Both bills promise hundreds of millions of dollars in new federal funding, despite the calls by protesters to defund, reduce police spending. But, Balko says, the reforms themselves are tepid. The Republican bill places no restrictions on the dangerous practice of no-knock raids. Instead, it asks that states collect data. The Democratic bill bars the use of no-knock warrants for federal drug investigations and cuts funding for any state or local jurisdiction that doesn't do the same. But the Dem bill requires only that police officers execute drug warrants only after providing notice of his or her authority and purpose. This knock-and-announce requirement is all but meaningless if you know that police officers frequently do so either simultaneously or just seconds before entering. The cops who killed Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, for example, claimed they did knock and announce. Her boyfriend, who started firing at them, doesn't agree with that. Anyway, Balko continues, neither bill satisfactorily provides for changing the current reality that bad cops are rarely held accountable. Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Floyd's neck, had 17 misconduct complaints in 18 years. He received only 2 letters of reprimand. Since 2012, the Minneapolis Police Department received over 2,600 civilian complaints of police misconduct, and only 12, that's right, 12 out of 2,600 were upheld. Balko continues, both bills do create national registries of police misconduct and require police agencies to check a potential new hire against it. But the Republican bill allows the registry to be accessed only by law enforcement officials. The Democratic bill does make the registry public, but like the GOP bill, doesn't sanction police departments who check a potential new hire against the registry, find a history of misconduct, and hire the guy anyway. A better bill would also include in the registry those officers found to have lied under oath, in police reports or in court, by prosecutors, internal affairs departments, or appellate courts. The Democratic bill does provide funding for local police to set up independent bodies to investigate police abuse and deaths in police custody, but it doesn't mandate that such bodies, even for federal police agencies. It doesn't mandate such bodies. Moreover, the list of acceptable investigative bodies that would be eligible for the grant include other police agencies. and he rightly criticizes this kind of faux oversight when one department investigates another. He continues, when it comes to constitutional rights, the Dem bill does end federal qualified immunity, which has often protected police officers from civil lawsuits. It's probably the most significant item in either bill. Unfortunately, Republicans have explicitly said there's no chance it will pass the Senate. And then Balco adds some ideas of his own, and I want you to hear these. Congress could lower the high hurdle that plaintiffs must clear to file a Monell claim, a lawsuit alleging that a police department's culture, policies, or training are so lacking that misconduct and constitutional violations are inevitable. Congress could also end the equitable sharing program, where police departments can get around state restrictions on civil asset forfeiture simply by partnering with a federal law enforcement agency, like your favorite DEA. They could also set up civilian review boards for federal police agencies like the DEA or ICE. And note, that's not even contemplated by the Democrats. They could also end the practice of federal sting operations that lure people into crimes, like the frame-ups of hundreds of Muslim Americans as purported domestic terrorists. And he says Congress could revive and codify the provocation rule, which says that if a police officer's interaction with someone escalates to the point where the officer uses force resulting in death or injury, and the officer is responsible for that escalation, he or she is liable for the citizen's injuries, even if by the time the officer deployed force, the force itself was then justifiable. So there's some great ideas in Balco's column. And I hope, since it's in the Washington Post, that some of our legislators, members of Congress, will be inspired to include them. Interesting piece at The Intercept today by a black journalist, George Cheedy, and he apparently is based in Atlanta, because he went to that now infamous Wendy's that was burned down after the police killing of Rayshard Brooks on June 12th. And he noted that it is now kind of a center for protesters, which is secured by a black man with an AR-15 standing guard. He said what began as a vigil for Brooks had transformed into something more militant. Young black men milled about with pistols and long guns, with gaudy accessories like a cheap scope or an extended pistol magazine. And the Atlanta cops were keeping an eye on it, but many of them are effectively on strike. So, in this vacuum, there are shots being fired at these armed black men, and Cheetah says that it's likely coming from white counter-protesters shooting from their cars. And this does militarize protest in a way that he correctly raises concerns about. One protester was arrested and cited with disorderly conduct at the scene after an exchange where demonstrators drew their guns and shot at a man as he drove away. Later that day, a 24-year-old woman was shot in the leg, and then earlier Saturday night, a second person got shot at a drive-by, also in the leg, a 35-year-old male. So, with the abdication of their duties by many members of the Atlanta police, there's one episode he cites here that on one evening, police began refusing to answer calls, and that the dispatcher went stretches of half an hour at a time without an officer responding. So this is a difficult situation, and I think that he does a good job of describing what is going on there, and it's got to be quite a challenge for Mayor Bottom. Or is it Bottoms? I'll have to check. Lee Fung has an interesting new report at The Intercept today. He does a lot of digging in government documents. And he writes, on May 26, as demonstrations around the country erupted over the police killing of George Floyd, the FBI signed an expedited agreement to extend its relationship with Dataminer. And that company spells its name without an E between the N and the R. They monitor social media. A few days later, the FBI modified an agreement it signed in February with Ventel, a Virginia technology firm that maps and sells the movements of millions of Americans. The company purchases bulk location data and sells it largely to government agencies. So what we're seeing here is that the commercial collection of data on you and me coming from social media and from the cell phones that we carry that disclose our location and where we've been, and now with the latest, contact tracing software, who we've been with, that they are increasingly using commercial operators to collect this data. And Fung writes, few regulations exist to restrict the use of location tracking data, a form of data collection that many common phone applications collect and monetize. The Supreme Court's 2018 Carpenter v. United States ruling said that government prosecutors require a warrant to obtain cell phone location data from service providers. But when they buy it from third-party brokers, it appears the law doesn't apply. I've long known that the state of Rhode Island has a much longer name. The full formal name is State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And it goes way, way back to the founding. I think his name was Roger Williams, was the guy who was kind of the driving force behind the creation of the colony and then statehood. Rhode Island was the first colony to abolish slavery in 1652, but the law was never enforced. The population of enslaved black people in the state rose to more than 6% by the end of the 17th century, nearly twice as high as any other colony in New England. And my stepson went to Brown University, based in Providence, and during the time he was there were revelations that the namesake of the university, a guy named Brown, was a slaveholder, and that there was a slave auction in Providence. The university issued some apologies at that time. I wanted to entertain you a little bit with some right-wing ranting. This showed up on my Facebook feed, and it comes from Front Page Mag, which is run by or linked to David Horowitz. And he is a right-wing provocateur who I've encountered over the years. I interviewed him a couple of times before he annoyed me so much that I wouldn't talk to him again. But he's a very aggressive and provocative guy who likes to redefine an argument to his benefit. So, this article says Minnesota State Representative claims that Antifa and Muslim groups plan to police Minneapolis under Muslim rule. And in an article that is short on facts and long on innuendo, they cite Minnesota State Representative Steve Green, who says what you're looking at, in my humble opinion, is communism moving into Minneapolis and St. Paul. And not just communism, but the leftist Islamic alliance. Now, that's not a quote. That is a statement in the article that builds on the quote from the legislator without any citation. That's what we call a polemic. Green asserted that Antifa and Muslim organizations plan to police Minneapolis under Muslim rule. And so they link together unrelated items, like the city council vote 2 weeks ago to abolish the police department in Minneapolis as it now exists. Now, they're quick to add that they're not going to fail to replace it. They simply feel that the agency as it exists is so far gone that it can't be reformed. So this extreme right-wing view builds on that and says that many have called for relying more on self-policing by the community in the way attendees often do at events like music festivals, with the police stepping in only when a true emergency arises. Some cited as an example how in the days after the killing of Mr. Floyd, teams made up of dozens of members of the American Indian movement patrolled streets and directed traffic in certain communities in Minneapolis. So they leap from that to the idea that armed Muslims, which have, they claim, Sharia patrols in Germany, Britain, and in parts of New York City, that's what's going to be developing in Minneapolis. And this is pure speculation. But I'm sure it feeds the frenzied minds of right-wingers who fear that Sharia law is going to be imposed on them here in the United States. Well, as you know, we are operating the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, offering $100 grants to people in need at this time. And I was really tickled to get this email last night. It's from Jonah Leto, and he is the son of Paul Leto, who is a loyal listener, a frequent commenter, and who I cited just on Monday, talking about his more accurate view of what's been going on in the occupied zone in Seattle. Well, this is his son, Jonah. He says, I'm a second-generation listener to your podcast. Earlier this month, I had a drive-through high school graduation. I haven't been able to get a job for summer, but I will move to Minneapolis to attend the University of Minnesota and live with my older sister. In lieu of paid work, I am traveling into Seattle as much as I can to record footage for a documentary film about the protests. Some of my footage so far includes being less than 50 feet away from the car that drove into the crowd, and a man got shot trying to stop the driver from killing people. He says food, basic health care, first aid, and water are all free in the CHOP zone, but I could sure use some help for transportation costs. So, Jonah, I am delighted to issue you a grant for $100, and we'll be mailing out a check to you today. And I wish you the best studying journalism in Minneapolis. And I've got some ideas that I'm going to talk to Jonah about, and we'll see if they gel. So if you are in need of $100 to help you through a tough time right now, don't be shy. Drop me an email, peter@peterbcollins.com, and we would love to assist you. The delayed New York primary, which did have a few hiccups, as we reported yesterday, nevertheless has produced some interesting interim results. Now, one no-brainer is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was challenged by several people, including a well-funded former CNBC anchor and registered Republican Michelle Caruso Cabrera, well, Cortez handily won the day with almost 70% of the primary vote, and Caruso Cabrera was showing about 18.7%. So that race has been called. The others, there are too many votes outstanding to come to a conclusion, and it may take as long as 2 weeks to get the final results. But it is encouraging, because we see that Eliot Engel, who was challenged by a former middle school principal, an African-American named Jamal Bowman, he appears to be going down in defeat. The numbers, I think I have a preliminary. No, I don't have on that race. But it certainly is promising when you see in consecutive cycles powerful Democrats being taken down first by a young woman like AOC, and now by this novice who took on Eliot Engel. Well, it's, I think, a good warning to incumbents that while most of you will survive, you cannot count on it. In the Bronx, Richie Torres, who is a city councilman, led a pack of contenders for the open seat of Congressman Jose Serrano. And there's also a guy named Mondaire Jones, who is challenging 6 other candidates to succeed retiring Congresswoman Nita Lowey. And Mondaire Jones, a Harvard-educated lawyer, has the lead in that pack. And Torres and Jones, if they win in November, would be the first openly gay black member or members of Congress. Also, an unusual situation in North Carolina. As you may know, Mark Meadows, a fire-breathing, knuckle-dragging right-winger of the Freedom Caucus, he resigned to become the White House chief of staff, and boy, does he regret it. That's just my guess. He handpicked a woman who he thought would be similar to him. Her name is Linda Bennett, and she lost big time to 25-year-old Madison Cawthorn. And Cawthorn was once nominated by Mark Meadows to attend the U.S. Naval Academy, but before he could get there, he was partially paralyzed in a near-fatal car accident, and he operates from a wheelchair, and he isn't even 25 yet. He will turn 25 before November, which would make him among the youngest ever to serve in Congress. And to do that, he's in a red district, but he's going to have to defeat Morris Davis, an Air Force veteran who goes by Mo, and he was once the chief prosecutor at Guantanamo. And I interviewed Mo Davis back in 2013. I have linked to that podcast if you'd like to check it out. At the time, the case of Bradley Manning, the court-martial, was underway at Fort Meade, and while Mo Davis is a military guy who didn't support Bradley Manning in every way, he didn't consider him to be a traitor, and he was pleasantly surprised that the judge in the court-martial found Manning not guilty of aiding the enemy. So for a military veteran and a prosecutor, too, he's a very interesting challenger in that red district in North Carolina. Well, the New York Times is bragging about its publishing its first poll of 2020. And it shows that Donald Trump has slid behind Joe Biden. It's a 14-point gap, with Biden polling at 50% and Trump at 36%. And as I've said, I don't believe that Biden has the strength to defeat Trump. But Trump can beat himself. And it appears that his bungling of the coronavirus and his authoritarian response to the George Floyd protests are hurting him among women and also among the white working-class males who were central to his vote count in 2016. So, for example, one of the surprising elements in this poll is that Biden leads Trump by 34 percentage points in 18 to 34 voters. Now, those are the people who were kind of weak in turning out for Bernie Sanders, and many of whom don't like Joe Biden. But that is a pretty strong showing there. Biden enjoys a 74% margin among black Americans against Trump. And so some of those numbers are pretty strong. According to the poll, white voters under 45 are overwhelmingly supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, while older whites are more tepid in their views toward racial justice activism. And nearly 70% of whites under 45 said they believe the killing of Floyd was part of a broader pattern of excessive police violence toward African Americans. So that could put interesting pressure on Joe Biden to back off from giving the police more money and at least making noises about cutting budgets and strengthening the reform package, as we cited from Radley Balco's column just a few minutes ago. Nearly 3/5 of voters disapprove of Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, including majorities of white voters and men. Self-described moderate voters disapprove of Trump on the virus by a margin of more than 2-1. By a 21-point margin, voters said the federal government should prioritize containing the coronavirus, even if it hurts the economy. And Maybe that will force Trump, who held another rally in Phoenix last night, didn't directly address the George Floyd protests except to demonize protesters as thugs and looters, and he doesn't talk about the coronavirus except to complain about how he's been blamed for it. He prefers to talk about his mythical wall. And just for a little balance here, interesting piece published at Mint Press News, originally appeared at the Black Agenda website. Margaret Kimberly is an outspoken woman who I respect. She said this presidential election season bears a striking resemblance to that of 2016. We were assured by pundits, pollsters, Democratic politicians, and million-dollar consultants that Trump couldn't possibly win, except he did, and the aforementioned experts should have been discredited and forgotten. 4 years later, the same people who should have been ignored forever are again claiming that Trump is on the ropes. The endless and useless anti-Trump talking points have done their damage. People who ought to know better glean dubious evidence and think that wishing for Trump's exit will get him out of the White House. At the same time, Joe Biden's campaign is fully within the sphere of right-wing neoliberalism, which lost in 2016. While millions of people whistle past the electoral graveyard, Joe Biden attacks Trump from the right. After Trump indicated a willingness to engage in talks with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, Biden tweeted his displeasure. Trump talks tough on Venezuela but admires thugs and dictators like Maduro. As president, I will stand with the Venezuelan people and for democracy. And Kimberly notes, it's Obama who began the assault on the Venezuelan people. It's fitting that his former vice president is happy to continue Trump's sanctions, which are war by other means, resulting in over 40,000 deaths. So there's some strong comments here. I've linked to it, and I hope you'll read it. It's in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the total number of cases to date is 9.3 million. Total death count is 478,000. Here in the United States, confirmed cases 2.3 million. Total deaths 121,000. Total testing now at 28 million. And new cases have surged. Yesterday, there were 34,000 new cases of the virus across the country. There have been only 2 previous days that the U.S. has reported more cases. Those were both in April. New cases have been surging for more than a week after trending down for more than 6 weeks. Several states on Tuesday set single-day records, including Arizona, California, Mississippi, Nevada, and Texas. And yesterday, the European Union announced that Americans are not invited to visit when they reopen their borders on July 1st. They're saying that the U.S. has not been able to manage the pandemic. They're also planning to ban travelers from China, Uganda, Cuba, Vietnam, and Brazil. And in a similar fashion, New York and surrounding states have announced that if you want to visit there from Texas, Arizona, or Florida, you're going to have to quarantine for 14 days. Governors Cuomo of New York, Murphy of New Jersey, and Lamont of Connecticut held a joint press conference to announce the policy, which will affect 9 states whose infection rates have met thresholds, indicating significant community spread. This is a first. And Texas has hit a new record as the federal government is reducing testing availability in the Lone Star State. About an hour after the nation's top public health officials denied to Congress that Trump had ordered a slowdown in testing, news broke that the federal government was winding down support for local testing sites in states like Texas. The Trump administration will end support for 13 sites in 5 states, including 7 in Texas, effective on June 30th. The sites were set up earlier this year to assist local authorities after a series of missteps led to a national shortage in available or affordable COVID-19 tests. As of Tuesday, Texas was reporting its highest number of new daily coronavirus cases yet, more than 5,000. Its last record was set just two days ago on Saturday at the 4,400 level. And Governor Abbott said, COVID-19 is now spreading at an unacceptable rate in Texas. It must be corralled. Oh, that's a Texas term. Closing down Texas again will always be the last option, though, he counseled. Coronavirus patients are filling up the hospitals in Texas, even as the governor, Greg Abbott, says there's abundant hospital capacity. As the number of patients hospitalized has reached record highs 12 days in a row, Abbott and other health officials have stressed that the state has abundant capacity to care for them. There are 14,000 available hospital beds, 1,500 ICU beds available. Gosh, can you reserve one online? But some hospital officials regionally are warning that ICUs are near or over capacity. In the hard-hit Houston region, hospitals have begun moving coronavirus patients from crowded ICUs to local officials, including, other local facilities. A local children's hospital said this week that it is admitting transfer patients to help ease the traffic in other facilities. A vaccine against COVID-19 may not work well in older people who are most at risk of becoming seriously ill and dying from the disease, according to scientists. A professor of immunology at UCL, president of the British Society of Immunology, said that scientists need to work out what goes wrong with the immune system as people get older. Well, I'm hearing a lot of talk about vaccines, and I think much of it is premature. And I think that there is this pressure from Trump to come up with one at what he calls warp speed, maybe even before the election in November. And historically, we've seen much longer processes for properly testing. And as we hear these caveats about how older people may be at risk despite a vaccine, I think we really need to hit the brakes here and allow the scientists to do their work. A new survey from the data firm Civic Science of nearly 2,500 U.S. adults finds that 65% of the general population over the age of 18 supports returning to lockdown if cases of COVID-19 rise significantly. Also, a recent poll of 7,000 small business owners finds that 43% that receive money from the Paycheck Protection Program say they could be out of cash within a month or less. And that's largely because they were forced to spend the money quickly so they could qualify to have the loans forgiven. An IBM Business Institute survey poll of more than 18,000 U.S. consumers in May and June found that 21% say they're shopping less because they fear the economy is going to get worse. And the stimulus checks directed by the CARES Act are aimed at helping American families, right? $1,200. But the 4 million Americans who got their payments on prepaid debit cards may be struggling with additional headaches, like the card's fees for withdrawing cash and the requirement to share their personal data. And Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire and 14 others wrote a letter to the Treasury Secretary to try to get some answers about this. That occurred yesterday. And according to a new Harris poll, 1/3 of Americans are considering moving to less densely populated areas in wake of the pandemic. This is based on a survey of 2,000 American adults in late April, found that nearly half of urbanites have looked online for homes, condos, or apartments to rent or buy away from the metropolitan area. And here in San Francisco, the figure is 1 in 13 leases have been broken in the last few months by people who either lost their jobs or can work from home and decided to move in with mom and dad or to just leave the big city and move somewhere else. Last week, we reported that Oakland Democrat Congresswoman Barbara Lee is calling for a major cut in defense spending. She didn't float a number. But Bernie Sanders is collaborating with the Progressive Caucus in the House, and they're proposing at least a 10% cut to Pentagon spending. And while it's unlikely that action will be taken on it in this congressional session, I do think that it's important to make this statement. I actually think that the 10% is too light. After all, the Pentagon budget has increased by more than $100 billion a year under Trump for no particular reason. And I think that's a nice number to start with. And as I've repeatedly argued, I believe the Democrats should be pushing for full repeal of the 2017 Trump and GOP tax cuts. So, over the next few days, there is a special peace summit among the former combatants in the war that split Yugoslavia. But one person will not be attending. The president of Kosovo, Hashim, and I think his name is Thakci, he turned around and flew back to Kosovo after he faced a 10-count indictment for war crimes, including 100 murders during the Yugoslav War. Bayer, the aspirin company that is a huge chemical giant based in Germany, they bought Monsanto a few years ago, and with it they bought the liabilities for the impact of Roundup. And it is a drug that, it's a pesticide, that is based on glyphosate, and it is believed to be a carcinogen that leads to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so after losing 3 major lawsuits, all right, the first one, a state court in California awarded $289 million to Dwayne Johnson, a school groundskeeper who'd been exposed to Roundup for years. Then a second trial in federal court here produced a verdict of $80 million for Edwin Hardiman, a homeowner who had used Roundup on his property. And 2 months after that, a third jury delivered a staggering award of more than $2 billion to Alva and Alberta Piliot, who argued that decades of using Roundup caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So without admitting guilt or that Roundup is a carcinogen, Bayer has agreed to create a fund of $10 billion to settle tens of thousands of claims, including some that they don't even know about yet. Now, this shows how desperate they are to avoid a court finding that Roundup and glyphosate are carcinogenic. But that may be inevitable because the district court here in San Francisco, under Judge Vince Chabria, will continue to look at these issues. And this is a preliminary step toward a finding about the carcinogenic properties of Roundup. Finally, today I wanted to leave you with a little smile. I don't know how many of my listeners watch The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, but like many comics, he's operating from his apartment in New York, and I think he's working harder than the other guys. In particular, Stephen Colbert just kind of, glides through the show. He doesn't work too hard, and he's always complaining about having to work from home, that he can't get back to the Ed Sullivan Theater. But last night on The Daily Show, they did a favor for the CIA, which has released its own recruitment television ad. And the CIA spot is predictably lame. But the Daily Show writers went at it and helped them with an alternate version. I will link to the video. It starts at about 7 minutes and 15 seconds in the Daily Show file, and we'll listen to the audio right now.
The world is filled with danger, and the CIA needs your help. In the Middle East, the Taliban are causing chaos, and yeah, we train them, But now we need your help to untrain them. There's chaos all over South America. Yeah, maybe it was all those coups we did, but with your help, we can uncoup them. And while you're at it, Gary has my flash drive. I need you to get it back. It's got all my vacation photos. The world we live in today is filled with threats, upheaval, and turmoil. And we made a lot of those things worse.
Didn't we also fill the inner cities with crap?
We don't talk about that.
The CIA. We broke it. Help us fix it.
Thank you, Trevor. A little truth in advertising there. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails